So here we are. It's a Tuesday rather than a Thursday, and we are lighting the candle, a world that works. And what we're talking about today is really up close and personal from our own perspective. As you might think, when I introduced my guest, Eric Lopkin, if you listen to the last segment, you know who Eric is, and you know he's a guy that's been up to some pretty special things in his life. And at the same time, we also can share firsthand knowledge of initiatives that we were both involved in that perhaps some of you were as well. And if we're talking about in the 70s, 80s, and 90s with things that weren't working and things that did work, and people that tried many different models in terms of whatever it was that they were trying to bring to their communities. So in the last half hour, what we talked about were what seems to be a behavioral breakdown, because the behaviors are the things that we have laws to correct, but we almost always write the laws after we've had the behavior that we want to correct, which basically means we did something. So that summarizes all of what the money, the legislation, Congress, City Hall. In the worst of situations, they pass legislation, as opposed to in the best situations, those communities that aren't experiencing these problems are actually having folks go out and work in the community. They're giving the police and the kids on the street an opportunity to get to know each other and to play together and know each other before something goes wrong, and they know the difference between right and wrong. So I'm going to introduce our guest again, because he's a good friend. He's also coincidentally the producer of this podcast, among others. And Eric, what are your thoughts with regard to, if we're lighting the candle on a problem that's conversational, where do we go from here, sir?
Yeah, I think, we keep talking about conversation, and I think that's really the cornerstone. We have to talk. We have to express opinions. We have to argue with opinions we don't agree with and debate, but not argue and resort to name calling. We need to actually debate these things, because this way, bad ideas fall by the wayside. And by hiding ideas, by canceling ideas, all it does is allow bad ideas to fester in the darkness. And that's really what lighting the candle is about, is shedding light on that darkness, letting these opinions out, debating them, discussing them, and sharing the insights so that we can move forward.
Exactly. And so this is a little different conversation than what we've been used to hearing lately. There are no losers in the conversation that we talk about. The only loser is the one who fails to open their mind up to a different point of view and hear what the other point of view is, without fearing and risking, they're losing their place in their own point of view. So when two people are debating each other from the standpoint of, it doesn't matter who's right, it only matters what's right. So let's have this conversation and explore what both of us can bring to it. And first, what is it that we're talking about? Number two is, what are the things that we can actually make a difference with? Number three, if we can make a difference with some of these things, how do we go about implementing those differences that can be made? Number four, how do we do this with our arms locked together as partners, as opposed to, making each other bad and wrong when things don't go as planned? And number four is constantly taking the time out to look back and see what worked and what didn't work before moving on to the next initiative. Those types of conversations that involve people who are on all sides of the spectrum. And I got to tell you, this is the neat thing. We talk about, the handcuffs of two ideas, right? This one or that. The truth is there are hundreds of them, but we have been trained to be locked in or locked out of any particular idea. We're either on one side of the color spectrum or on the other side of the color spectrum, on the nationality, sexual orientation, et cetera, et cetera. The last 40 years have been really, really good at getting people to believe they are one thing or another in their own mind. They came to this of their own,
Yeah,
decision because
that's
they only gave you two choices.
that's very true. And I think part of it is, when you have either or, one or two, whether you're one or whether you're two, that is in your comfort zone. And when you go into the gray area between them or outside of them, even, people get very nervous when they're going outside their comfort zone into, the gray. And the fact of the matter is, most of the world is gray. There's very little that's black and white. But because people get so nervous and so uncomfortable doing this, they retreat back to their self-identity and they fight anybody that's going to challenge that self-identity. And in doing that, they not only lock themselves into, a certain viewpoint, but what's worse is that they're locking themselves out of opportunities that are out there and resources that are out there that they may not already know about. And they sort of just, this is where I am, this is where I'm staying, I don't want to be out there. And it happens, everything, I've always said, education is really important in overcoming society's problems. And I've also always fallen back on an old Mark Twain quote that says, I have never let my schooling get in the way of my education.
Amen. So the interesting, kind of footnote to what you're talking about is that the insidious nature of this indoctrination is that we all believe we came to these decisions about ourselves on our own.
Yeah, and that's, in most cases, that's not true. Just think about religion as a whole. How many people in, the total population chose their religion rather than just being whatever religion their parents were?
It's a very small number, yes.
Yeah, and that's how all of this goes about, is you're exposed to ideas at a young age, and you go, oh, this is how the world is. And then you go out in it and you find, well, maybe it's not exactly like this. Maybe some of it is like this and some isn't. And all of those ideas that we had set as kids are now being challenged. And it's like, well, wait a minute, no. My parents would never have steered me wrong. It's got to be back the way it was then. Rather than, well, okay, that's how it was explained to a 5-year-old, to a 10-year-old. Now you're an adult. It's time you realize things are more complicated than that and open up to find out how they're different and what complexities there are. Because just because something's complex doesn't mean it's bad.
Right. And the nature of complexity is that it comes from being simple first. It's called compound simple, participles, okay? So you've got these particles that are all simple, but they're complex once you see the whole thing. And we talked about the melting pot and the mosaic. The same thing can be said for a stew. In any conversation is really a stew where there's more ingredients that are added. However, the way that it's done, nobody knows how it got to where it is right now. There's no one actually taking the time to fully understand every part of the conversation in such a way that they could explain it, or, as they call deconstructing it in food, where you have a deconstructed hamburger or lasagna or something. If you could deconstruct an argument and each person could sit down and you could lay out, these are the foundational points. It's this point plus this point plus this point. And we can look at those and we can start to ask questions if we're committed to making things better. That's the first test. If we're not committed to making things better and we just either want attention or we want to make a mess or we have some other agenda that is not about making things better, then that's not a conversation going on. And it's not even argument. It is actually a battle.
Yes, that's so true. And I love the example of the stew, because that's really where we need to start conversations. Because if you look at a stew, yes, there's all of the different meats, vegetables, potatoes, whatever it is that's in there, and you can see those. They are separate. They have their own identities, but the bulk of the stew is actually the broth that all of these ingredients have added to. And when you have a stew, one of the things that you're aware of is that the ingredients all have more in common now that they've been cooked together than they do separate elements. And that's how people are. When you get right down to it, we have more in common with each other than we have differences. And if we start from what we have in common, that propels a conversation forward.
Well, see, what you're saying is very powerful, Eric. And the whole idea is that why would somebody want us to focus on being different?
Honestly, there's a lot of money in focusing people on being different.
Oh, yeah.
And the example I always use is Reverend Al Sharpton, because Reverend Al Sharpton back in the day was run of the mill reverend, very little in the resources department. But when he started preaching differences, when he started protesting and started separating people and telling people that they had to be different, well, Reverend Al went from bankruptcy to millionaire on this platform. And I use him as an example, but there are hundreds and possibly thousands of people that if I sit down, and these are not people of any one particular race, creed, or color, it's pretty much universal, where they go, you know what? If I preach differences, it's good for me. I can benefit from this.
Yes.
And they don't really care about the damage they're doing.
Right, because for every person who's out saying X, there are thousands of other people saying Y, Z, A, K, R.
Yep.
And the whole thing is that when what you say resonates with somebody who has decided over time, and they think it's their decision again, that their ideals and their ideas line up with your speaking, now all of a sudden you've got a paying audience. Isn't that cool?
Exactly.
I have a lot.
On one of our sister podcasts, Carnivore Radio, we've discussed this, and this is a podcast was originally on terrestrial radio, and we've actually been discussing this for the better part of 10 years, how people have fallen into echo chambers. And you have your point of view, so you get your news from a news channel or a news source that shares your point of view. And the more you do this, the less you're exposed to opposing viewpoints, the more separate people become, and the less informed everybody becomes, because you're not getting the whole story. You're just getting the small part that they think matches your worldview.
Exactly. So now here we are. Eric, you might have an answer to this. Do you know how many networks there are?
I don't know that. And quite frankly, I don't know at this point that anybody does, because there's literally networks being formed every day.
So let's talk about cable networks for a moment, okay?
Yeah.
Streaming networks, cable networks, any so-called network that I'm going to say it has funding, it has content, and it has a schedule. It has, it's on every single week. I'm going to go wild here for a second, and let's just for giggles, give me some room, and let's say there are 150. I think there's more, but
there's a lot more than that. But we can use that number, for the case of discussion.
We're going to talk about 150. All of the little things like CNBC, C-SPAN, ABC. We're not talking about, all of the local broadcasting, WTIC. We're talking about just the networks. So each one of those networks is an organization that needs to fund its operations somehow, some way. And those organizations that cannot fund uh, their programming with advertising, they do it through donations. And there are a lot of content providers out there that, believe it or not, are getting they're getting funding from major corporations. And I mean, it actually has absolutely nothing to do with doing a good job at anything, but it has everything to do with a point of view.
It has to do with the point of view. And yeah, it's funny. I heard a discussion just this morning. They were talking about the Wuhan lab and the plausibility of whether or not COVID was developed in that lab and got out. And one of the people was speculating because early on, all of the news networks went, "Oh no, that it can't be. There's no validity to that." And now a year later, they're actually finding, there was scientific evidence that did support this. But it was speculated that one of the reasons that the news organizations dismissed the idea out of hand was the fact that most of the major news organizations are owned by companies that also own motion picture companies. Sony, Viacom, Warner Brothers, they all own news organizations and they all own motion picture studios. And those motion picture studios need the Chinese audience. So were these news companies going easy on China because they didn't want to upset the apple cart for their other entertainment divisions?
Well, see, that's an interesting question of almost any, shall we say, entertainment. It goes for sports. It goes for just about everything on. Yeah. And let me just ask you this question: what percentage of all of those media corporations are owned by the CCP?
I'm sorry, by who?
In every one of those instances that you were talking about, you can trace the ownership in many of those back to the Chinese government having ownership interest in almost all of them, including Sony.
Oh yeah, as public companies, their shareholders range far and wide, and that's something that I always find very amusing about the communist government in China is that they crack down on capitalism except when it benefits them, and then they're really quick to buy companies.
Well, see, that's the thing. And once you have the entire world in your debt, including the United States, they were not doing that for altruistic reasons for 30 years.
Right.
They really knew that at some point in the future, in order to, be in charge, the world domination deal didn't go over so well. So I think they found in focus groups that they could come back and say, being a benevolent benefactor, or whatever the words were that seemed to make a lot more sense as they were continuing to buy out assets in the United States, buildings, corporations, you name it. And here we are, in the midst of all of this, people thinking that they're getting the straight scoop.
Yeah, there's very little straight scoop out there. And in fact, I used to have at my home DirecTV, and this is years and years ago. They had this one channel called Newsmix, and literally what it was on one screen, you had CNN, MSNBC, Fox News, CNBC, Bloomberg, and one other, I don't remember. And you had them all on the same screen, and you could just toggle the audio between them.
Right.
And watching, in particular, Fox and MSNBC at the same time, and flipping the audio between the two when they were covering the same story was like watching something in alternate dimensions. I mean, they were so far apart. But the fact of the matter is, if you didn't get both of those point of views and understand that the truth was somewhere in the middle, you were missing out on a big part of the stories.
Well, yes, and the fact of the matter is no story can be presented in its entirety in 2-minute bullets. Okay, here's
No,
what happened in wherever today, and showing people's faces and showing the damage and the hun, and now on to the next story, right? Well, here's the deal. Not only are we in the midst of no conversation, remember, we got to come back to how we're lighting the candle, because we're lighting the candle, right, Eric?
That's the goal here.
Yeah. So the whole idea is, you at home, you got to ask yourself, how do I challenge, and what kind of good questions can I come up with? Because I don't care what you believe. I really don't. And the main thing here is, are you living in an empowerment zone where you can get out of bed every single morning, go and do the things that you've got to do without worry of what'll happen to you or your loved ones, or whether or not somebody's going to lie to you today, either on a grand scale or just in a meeting that you're going to. And people only have that behavior because the alternative of telling the truth is either not accepted or is dangerous, right? So where we're coming from in all of this conversation is, if you're starting to hear new stories where last year, the year before that, stuff would come out, there would be publications that basically said that something amiss took place prior to the election in 2016, and there was something amiss that took place after the election in 2016, and the month after that, and the month after that, and none of it got carried in the main media. But now organizations are finally getting a voice to where it's undeniable, and journalists are so embarrassed about their lockstep with whatever the dogma was, one way or the other. I mean, we're calling balls and strikes here. We're not caring about whether they're conservative or they're liberal or this or that. Who's telling the truth? Who's actually giving you the thing that you need to hear so that you can have the great question and find out what really happened?
Yeah, that's the thing. I mean, lighting the candle can be uncomfortable because you need to learn more than what hits you in a day-to-day situation. And I think the best way that people can light the candle is to question everything, learn, and check your sources. I've had conversations with folks that have all sorts of medical theories, and of course these are not doctors. And my first response is, go to PubMed, which is where all of the scientific research is actually archived, and you can read abstracts of the research. We all learned in elementary school, or at least we did back when I was in elementary school. I hope they're still teaching it now, about primary sources. Look at primary sources. Listen to people who are actually on the ground rather than interpreting something. And don't be afraid to question. Right or wrong, questioning to understand better is never a bad thing.
Agreed, and that's what conversation is about as well. Conversation to convince, I don't know, but conversation to gain a greater awareness and to understand. Well, see, that's what we're talking about here. You make the world a better place when one person has a disagreement with the other person, and they both walk away after having put the energy into a sincere, engagement, and they both better understand what the other person is standing for, what's important to them. Even if they don't agree, they at least have that window open where they can see it.
Right. You don't have to agree with everyone in order to be friends with them, in order to talk with them. People have differences. And I have always fallen back on an old saying, I may not agree with what you say, but I will fight to the death your right to say it.
See, that is the way I was raised also, and that has to do with the First Amendment.
Yeah.
And that First Amendment is sacrosanct. And unfortunately, there are so many people out there right now. I stopped at the mall when I was walking over there. I do somewhere between 1 and 3 miles a day. Lately, less than more. But I saw a young man sitting down and taking a few moments for himself. And I asked him, I said, um, what do you think about masks? And he said, I generally like to do what it takes, to get along. He says, I'm happy to wear it. I don't mind. And he said, I want to believe that it makes a difference and it makes it safer for other people. And I said, well, good for you. And I said, well, can you answer a question for me? Do you think that the government does enough for us? And he looked at me for a minute and he said, yeah. He said, they give me a lot of freedom, to do what I like to do. I'm, I don't need anything from them, but I know from other people that do need things from the government. They're pretty happy with what the government is doing for them and how they're allowing them to live their lives. And I thought to myself, I said, have you read the Constitution? And he said, no. He said, I've heard a lot about it. He says, but it just seems way too complicated for me. And I said, so you didn't have, government economics, or any type of civics classes where you talked about how the government works and what the branches are and all that stuff. He said, no. He said, that really isn't relevant to our lives these days, is it? And I said, I don't know. I'm kind of interested in your thoughts on that. And I said, well, when do you think it would be important, for the government to operate to some set of rules, like say a constitution? And he said, that's an interesting question. He said, I don't even have any idea what you mean by that. I said, well, look, do you believe that the Constitution is a document that tells how the government can give rights and privileges to the people of the country? Or do you believe that it's a document where the people give the rights to the government to act on it in the group's best intent? And he said, no. He said, the government gives us all of our rights. There's no question about that. Just look around. He says to me, he said, you don't have to look far for that. They've been telling us to wear a mask for a year. What if we didn't wear it?
It's actually scary because we grew up being taught that the government gets its power from the people, not the other way around.
Right.
And those of us of a certain generation will remember turning on the TV on Saturday morning and having them sing, We the People in order to form a more perfect union on Schoolhouse Rock, and how a bill becomes a law on Schoolhouse Rock. And we learned it, just during Saturday morning cartoons. It was that important that they couldn't wait for it to get to us in school. They had to come and make sure we knew that as kids. And that seems to have fallen by the wayside. I've had conversations with people who are now in Congress who have no idea how Congress is supposed to work.
Agreed. And you know what? If you recall, Eric, in order to get certified as a broadcaster, back in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, you had to commit to and then demonstrate that you actually did give airtime to not-for-profit schoolhouse kinds of things, right?
The public service programming.
Exactly.
And if you watch enough TV, which most of us don't watch so much TV, enough to see this anymore.
Right. So anyhow, this has been remarkable.
Give your opinion is they have to get their license renewed.
Absolutely. Especially when it was time to do the audit and show where they actually performed.
Correct. Doesn't counteract so much of what goes on over the air.
Well, Eric, I think the universe is trying to tell us something here. I just lost you completely for a moment. I want to thank you again, good friend, for coming on here and sharing your thoughts with our listening audience and with me in particular. Once again, ladies and gentlemen, we just never know what we're going to talk about when we light up this thing. And especially in these spotlights, we kind of let the conversation go where it wants to go. But in the end, our goal is not to convince you of anything, but to leave you in a space where you've got some ideas that come to you and give you this opening to consider and just keep asking better questions. Make your life an ongoing quest for knowledge and understanding, so that when somebody comes to you and messes with you, that you are unmessable.
Exactly. Lighting the candle is about including everybody and learning new ideas. So if we've given you just a little bit to think about, that's it. We're, follow up with that and look into things, question everything, question us. We want you to explore.
Amen. Absolutely. So I think that concludes our podcast for the day. Again, Eric, thank you so much. It's so great working with you.
It was my pleasure to be here.
All right. You be well, and I will see you soon, my friend.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
You've been listening to Lighting the Candle, a world that works, part of the Exvadio Podcast Network. You can hear us at exvadio.com/podcasts, Apple Podcasts app, Google Play, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Stitcher, and wherever you find podcasts.